Tonight the city lies still, like a living being breathing slowly. Golden lights spill across the empty streets, reflecting on the glass in quiet streaks, like fragments of memory. In a small room, someone sits before a mirror, staring into their own eyes. Eyes that should be familiar, yet somehow feel so distant. We go on living, smiling, speaking of dreams and freedom. Yet deep within, there's a part of us that has never truly lived. We hide that part beneath our work, behind the roles we play, under the words we use to please others. And then one day, when all the noise fades away, we suddenly hear a faint voice rising from within. The voice of the shadow, of the forgotten soul. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Perhaps we are not truly bound by destiny, but merely led by the invisible parts of ourselves. And tonight, as you listen to this story, let your heart open. For sometimes, light does not come from the outside, but from the very darkness you have the courage to step into. 1. The parting at Pemberley. When the final glance speaks the unspoken. The morning at Pemberley was as gentle as the first breath of day. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and lingered upon the still surface of the lake, where the sky reflected itself like the mirror of a soul. Elizabeth paused on the grass-lined path, her heart torn between emotion and reason. From afar, Darcy approached, tall, composed, yet his eyes carried a quiet sadness. They stood in silence. No words could suffice, only a stillness so deep that one could almost hear the beating of one's own heart. In that moment, Elizabeth suddenly understood that true affection does not arise from reason. It is not the triumph of the ego, but the melting of two souls once lost and wandering. Every prejudice, every pride she once clung to became small, dissolving like mist before dawn. In Darcy's gaze, Elizabeth saw herself reflected, the part she had long hidden, tender, fearful of pain, yet achingly sincere. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. To meet is to be transformed." And from that moment, Elizabeth knew she was no longer the same, nor was Darcy. Between them, it was no longer a clash of egos, but the meeting of two shadows, the hidden parts they had long denied. Elizabeth saw within Darcy the loneliness beneath his pride, and Darcy, in her eyes, found the sincerity he had once rejected within himself. As she left Pemberley, Elizabeth felt as if she were parting with a piece of her soul. The mist-covered path before her seemed like a passage into the unconscious, where she must face herself. For separation, in Jung's view, is not an ending, but a rite of transformation. It is the moment when the unconscious begins to speak, when the soul is called home to confront its own truth. Elizabeth once thought herself wise, independent, capable of seeing life with clarity. Yet now, in the silence, she realized intellect cannot save the heart. What she had called confidence was merely an armor to conceal her fear of being hurt, and Darcy, the seemingly invulnerable man, carried within him the fear of rejection, the sorrow of one forced always to be strong. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Perhaps destiny does not lie outside us. It is composed of the unseen parts within. Elizabeth understood then that all along it was her shadow, her pride, her judgment, her fear of trust that had cost her what truly mattered. Only when Darcy's gaze turned away, when silence took the place of words, did she finally hear the true voice of her heart. In that instant, Pemberley was no longer just an estate. It became a symbol of an illuminated soul. There, she saw not only Darcy, but the deepest part of herself, the part that longed to love and be loved, yet had never dared to admit it. Darcy stood there, still and silent, his gaze vast as the sky. Within that silence, Elizabeth felt more than words could ever say. Regret, gratitude, and the gentle affection they had never dared to name. No words were needed. Both understood this was the end of an old chapter, and the beginning of another. The journey toward awareness. Jung once wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, there love is lacking." Love can only blossom when one surrenders the dominance of the ego. And at Pemberley, in that quiet farewell, Elizabeth and Darcy relinquished that power to rediscover themselves. The carriage began to move, Pemberley fading into the mist. Yet within Elizabeth, another door had opened. She no longer saw Darcy as the man once rejected, but as a mirror illuminating the path she must take, the path inward. Love, as Jung saw it, is never merely a story of two people. It is the meeting of the conscious and the unconscious, between who we think we are and who we truly are. And on that tender morning, Elizabeth Bennet awakened from the dream of her own prejudice. She began to understand that love is not a destination and but a journey of the soul toward wholeness. As Pemberley vanished beyond the trees, Elizabeth closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she still saw his gaze, calm, deep, profoundly human, a gaze that spoke no words of love, yet held love in its entirety. And in that moment she knew, though they parted, they had truly met, not through words, but through their souls. 2. The letter and the scandal, bad news amid the storm of the family. The sky that day was heavy with leaden gray. Low clouds sank upon the hilltops, as if announcing an approaching storm. Elizabeth sat by the window of the inn, the dim light touching her face as the maid entered, carrying a letter, the seal of Jane. A fleeting sense of calm crossed her mind, but within the first few lines her face turned pale. Lydia has run away with Wickham. All sound vanished. The world around her collapsed into silence. The room, the candle, her breath, all frozen in that instant. Elizabeth dropped the letter. Her hand trembled. Lydia, her innocent, impulsive sister, had eloped with the very man she had once believed to be honorable, the one she had blindly defended against all warnings. The first feeling was not anger, but a quiet, searing guilt. Elizabeth knew that her own silence, her pride in appearing wise, had helped sow the seeds of this tragedy. Now the fragile veil of the Bennet family's honor had been torn apart, revealing all they had long hidden, their naivety, their vanity, and the unconscious forces none had dared to face. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. There is no awakening without suffering." And in this moment of crisis, Elizabeth understood that she was crossing the threshold of awakening, a collision between light and darkness within her own soul. She rose and looked out the window. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping gently on the stone steps. Each drop like a slow, steady, mournful heartbeat. Her mind swirled with images. Lydia's careless laughter, her mother's anxious obsession with marriage, and her father clever but indolent, hiding from responsibility behind his sardonic wit. The Bennet family had lived too long in comfortable illusions, where the ego was indulged and truth remained veiled. Jung once warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And now Elizabeth saw it clearly. Lydia's fate was not imposed by any outside force, but born from a collective blindness, from the unexamined depths of their family soul. Wickham, the man who had charmed the whole town with his smile and polished manners, now appeared in Elizabeth's mind as the image of the shadow, seductive yet perilous. He was the embodiment of the darkness the Bennets had unknowingly nurtured. Their innocence, their passions, their craving for love without understanding. Lydia had not merely run away with Wickham. It was the family's own unconscious that had fled with the illusion of love. Elizabeth clutched the letter, tears spilling freely. She whispered to herself, "How could I have been so careless? How could I have believed the words of a liar, simply because he said what I wished to hear? The question was not for Wickham alone, but for herself, the woman who once believed she saw clearly. Now, Elizabeth realized that her pride in judgment had merely been another way to avoid truth. Jung once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." And in that moment, Elizabeth began to know her own darkness. She understood that only by facing error and pain can one truly see the essence of oneself. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the sound drumming against the window like the beating of a frantic heart. Elizabeth read the letter again, each line cut deeper than before. But alongside the pain arose another feeling, strange, calm, and deep, the quiet forming of awareness. She realized that Lydia's scandal was not merely a disgrace to the family. It was a revelation that the shadow had come to be seen. It could no longer be denied, hidden beneath the comfort of dinners, social chatter, or dreams of status. The disaster was the unconscious calling them, forcing them to mature. Elizabeth closed her eyes. In that darkness, she heard again the words Darcy had once spoken about Wickham, words she had dismissed as arrogance. Now they echoed as truth. Regret swelled within her, yet mingled with gratitude. For though it came late, she had glimpsed the light behind the veil of her own prejudice. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Jung. And Elizabeth understood. Lydia was the darkness she must face, the mirror reflecting her own unripe self, the part that once believed love was passion, not understanding. The rain fell all afternoon and into the night. In the silent room, Elizabeth sat alone by the candlelight. Jane's letter lay upon the table, blurred with tears, but her face was no longer that of the proud girl she once was. Something had changed, a serenity, a quiet strength, a deeper gaze. She knew her world had cracked, but through that crack light had begun to enter. And amid the rain outside, Elizabeth heard something faint, like the whisper of a soul. "You're not being destroyed. You're being remade." Amid the storm, she realized, this was not merely catastrophe, but the initiation of the soul, where darkness, instead of being feared, is finally seen as the necessary part of one's becoming. And that night, as Elizabeth lit another candle, its soft glow reflected in her tearful eyes, she understood that life had opened a new chapter, the chapter of awareness, where light no longer comes from fleeing the dark, but from daring to look into it. 3. The journey home, returning through despair. That day, the sky was cast in a dull shade of leaden gray, heavy, as though waiting for something to break. The road leading back to Longbourn was damp after the rain, and the carriage wheels turned slowly through the muddy ground, leaving deep grooves like the scars of memory. Elizabeth sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes following the glistening field streaming past. Beside her, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner remained silent. No one spoke, because everything that needed to be said had already been swallowed by panic. The dreadful news about Lydia was still like a cold blade lodged in her heart. Lydia has run away with Wickham. Each time those words returned to her mind, Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. She could not believe, or rather she did not want to believe, that her blindness, her pride, and her silence had all played a part in this disaster. Every step of the horses striking the wet earth sounded like the thudding of a guilty conscience. She had only one wish, to return to Jane, to hold her hand, to weep with her, to endure together the pain that had now befallen their entire family. The journey back to Longbourn was no longer a voyage. It was a drifting through waves of fear, regret, and guilt. Carl Jung once said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. No soul can reach the light without first passing through its own hell." And today, Elizabeth was passing through hers. Not a place outside, but the hell within her soul. She gazed out the window, where sky and earth dissolved together in the mist. The scenery slipped by like fragments of a dream, cottages, stone walls, trees bent by the wind. But in her mind, there was only one image, Jane's face, serene and gentle, yet surely breaking inside. Elizabeth imagined her sister sitting alone, trying to comfort their mother, steady their father, and hold the house from collapsing. And she felt her own heart torn in two, one half wanting to cry, the other forcing itself to stay composed. Jung once wrote, "The descent into the unconscious is the necessary prelude to real transformation. The descent into the depths is the beginning of every true transformation." And Elizabeth understood. This very moment, as hopeless as it seemed, was opening a door toward her own maturity. For years, she had taken pride in her intellect, in her clarity of judgment. But now, when everything had fallen apart, she saw that reason alone saves no one. She had judged others from the safety of her own ideals, speaking of virtue, of dignity, while never daring to face the shadows within herself. She had mocked her mother for being shallow, sneered at her father's indifference, and laughed at the foolishness of others, unaware that her own pride was simply another form of ignorance. The carriage stopped at a small inn. Rain poured heavily outside. They gathered around the fireplace, the flickering light casting weary reflections upon their faces. Mrs. Gardner gently placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "You must hold yourself together, Lizzie. Your family needs you to be strong." Elizabeth pressed her lips together and nodded, but inside she felt only emptiness. Strong, she thought. How could she be strong when her very soul was dissolving like ashes? Outside, the rain fell steadily, like the heartbeat of the earth. Elizabeth stared into the fire. She thought of Darcy, the man she had once rejected, the man she had called proud. In her mind, his words echoed, calm, steady, about honor, duty, and loyalty. Now, as everything lay in ruins, she realized that he had been the one who truly understood responsibility and silence. And she, who had once thought herself wise, was only now beginning to grasp the true nature of compassion. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And Elizabeth knew she had done exactly that. She had avoided facing her soul by judging others. Now, with nothing left to defend, with truth laid bare like an open wound, she was forced to look within. That night, as the inn fell silent, Elizabeth could not sleep. The rain tapped on the roof like a melancholy rhythm. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness she saw Lydia, naive, reckless, yet a mirror of the suppressed instincts of the Bennet family itself. Elizabeth realized that every person carries within them a part like Lydia, childlike, impulsive, chasing illusions of love. The difference is only this: some dare to acknowledge it, others spend a lifetime avoiding it. When the carriage resumed its journey the next morning, the sun hid behind a veil of mist, its pale light spreading over the land like a fragile consolation. From afar, the red roof of Longbourn came into view. The house was still there, but to Elizabeth, it was no longer the same. It was no longer the home of laughter and bustling dinners, but a battlefield of souls being tested. Carl Jung once said, "Only the wounded physician heals. Only those who have been wounded can bring healing." And Elizabeth understood that from this day forward, she was no longer the witty girl of the ballroom. She had become a soul learning to walk the path of healing, for herself and for those she loved. As the carriage stopped before the gate, Elizabeth lifted her eyes to the pale gray sky. The wind carried the cool scent of rain, cold yet pure. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart beat again, slow, steady, and conscious. "Perhaps," she whispered, "the storms don't come to destroy us, but to help us see what we have long forgotten." And as she stepped down, setting her feet upon the wet earth, Elizabeth knew her return was not a journey of despair. It was the journey of a soul learning to face its own darkness, and through it, to find the light that had always been waiting within. For the house in chaos, the home in turmoil, The iron gates of Longbourn closed behind her, and Elizabeth stood still amid the gray haze of the afternoon. The road she had just traveled seemed to stretch endlessly, not merely the distance from London to home, but a passage through shame, fear, and the lingering storm within her heart. The house before her, once filled with laughter, afternoon tea, and the sound of Jane's piano, now stood silent and disordered, like a soul crying out for rescue. As soon as she crossed the threshold, Elizabeth heard the piercing cries of her mother echoing from the sitting room. "We are ruined. Our family is destroyed." Mrs. Bennet's trembling voice mingled with broken sobs. The air of the house was heavy, trembling with panic, as if even the walls themselves were shaking. Mrs. Bennet sat in the middle of the room, clutching a handkerchief soaked with tears, ceaselessly lamenting and blaming Lydia for her foolishness, Mr. Bennet for his weakness, and fate itself for its cruelty. Jane sat quietly beside her, her face pale, her gentle eyes still carrying the last trace of calm, the final light within a home that had lost its order. "Mother, everything will be all right," she whispered, though her voice trembled, as if her faith itself were about to break. Elizabeth approached, placed a hand upon her sister's shoulder, and said nothing. There are pains that words cannot soothe. Only presence can. Behind a half-closed door, Mr. Bennet sat alone in his study. The oil lamp cast a faint glow on his weary face. When Elizabeth entered, he looked up, his eyes stripped of the wit they once held. "I have failed, Lizzie," he said quietly, his voice thick with remorse. "I let my daughter fall into the hands of a man I once called a friend. I have protected no one, not even my own children." Elizabeth stood in silence. In that moment, she saw her father, once the symbol of reason and sharp insight, now a man crushed beneath the weight of his own indifference. For years, he had mistaken wisdom for silence, cleverness for detachment. But it was that very detachment that had led his family to the edge of ruin. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived life of the parents." Elizabeth understood this more clearly than ever. Her father, hiding in his books, and her mother, dreaming of marriages, had never truly lived, merely repeated the roles that society had handed them. And now, as the curtain fell, only emptiness remained. That evening, Longbourn felt like a house swept by floodwaters. Her mother's cries, her sister's whispers, the wind slipping through the cracks of the door. Each member was trapped within their own small world. Elizabeth walked down the dark hallway, her fingers brushing the cold walls. The house no longer felt like a home, but rather a mirror reflecting the darkness within their collective soul. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And Elizabeth understood that this moment, when every illusion had been stripped away, when honor became a burden and love turned into pain, was the very moment they were being forced to see themselves. She stepped out onto the porch, where the wind stirred the rain-soaked flowers. Each petal drooped, heavy and silent, like her own heart. She thought of Lydia, her naive, impulsive sister, who was also a mirror reflecting the instincts their family had long denied. Lydia's recklessness was not born merely of foolishness, but of a home that had never taught her what love truly was. They had only taught her to marry someone good enough, rich enough, respectable enough. And now, that fragile enough had turned to mist. Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Elizabeth knew her mother was doing exactly that. In her sobbing, Mrs. Bennet was not weeping for Lydia. She was mourning her own fear of humiliation, and her father, seemingly stoic, was hiding in silence as if by saying nothing, the guilt might vanish on its own. Only Jane was different. Though fragile and grieving, she still chose to hope. In Jane's weary eyes, Elizabeth saw a small flame, not bright, but warm, It was not naive optimism, but compassion. The only thing that remained pure in this broken home. Night fell. The wind moaned against the window panes. Elizabeth sat by her bed, watching the candle burn low. She no longer wished to find someone to blame. Darkness had filled every corner, and she knew, to survive, they would have to kindle a new light. The light of truth. Carl Jung once wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. Within every chaos lies hidden order. Within every collapse, a concealed meaning." Elizabeth closed her eyes. In her mind, Longbourn was no longer just a worn old house. It was a symbol of the human soul, where reason, instinct, and love collide to give birth to awakening. By morning, the crying would still echo, the fear would still remain. But deep inside, Elizabeth sensed something had shifted. She was no longer the girl of pride and judgment. She had seen the raw truth and understood that sometimes, only when the soul is shattered, can light begin to enter. Outside, the wind had stilled. The rain had ceased. Elizabeth stepped toward the window and looked toward the horizon. Through the gray clouds, a thin ray of light broke through, fragile yet steadfast, and she knew, from this chaos, something new would be born, a beginning for herself, for her family, and for the soul learning to rise from the ruins. 5. The father's search, the father's journey through despair. That morning, thick fog blanketed the plains of Hertfordshire. The sky seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy, silent, so still one could hear the grinding of carriage wheels over the damp road. Elizabeth stood by the window, watching her father's figure fade slowly into the milky mist. Mr. Bennet sat in the small carriage, wrapped in a dark worn coat, his hat pulled low over half his face, leaving only his eyes, weighed down by worry and exhaustion. No one spoke. Mrs. Bennet wept uncontrollably, while Jane held Elizabeth's hand tightly, trying to keep her composure. Elizabeth did not cry. Inside her was a silence so deep it felt frozen, as cold as that autumn morning. When the carriage passed through the gate, Elizabeth heard the faint clang of iron, the sound of a chapter closing in the Bennet family's life, as fate crossed the threshold on the weary steps of a desperate father. For years, Mr. Bennet had been the quiet, clever, yet distant father, hiding his fatigue behind sarcasm, his disappointment behind laughter. He had lived by standing apart, more an observer than a participant. But now, as the storm swept away his family's honor and trust, he was forced to step beyond the walls of detachment he had built around himself. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. There is no awakening without suffering." And Elizabeth understood that her father was now walking that very path, not only to find Lydia, but to rediscover the soul he had long abandoned. In the house, now stripped of laughter, Elizabeth and Jane endured the long days of waiting. Each morning, the ticking of the clock echoed through the room like the slow heartbeat of time. Mrs. Bennet lay in bed, weeping and lamenting. Kitty drifted in shallow dreams, oblivious to the weight of the situation. The burden fell upon the two eldest daughters. Elizabeth tried to remain calm, but each time a knock sounded at the door, her heart tightened, caught between hope and fear. "Perhaps they have found Lydia," Jane whispered, her voice trembling, afraid to shatter the fragile air of anticipation. But when the servant opened the door, it was only a delivery boy or a meaningless letter. The light in their eyes dimmed once more. At night, Elizabeth often sat by the window, gazing out at the misty fields. In the darkness, she imagined her father, alone in vast London, wandering through the streets, asking strangers for help, carrying within him a remorse no one could lift. She saw him as an old traveler, lantern flickering in hand, walking through a forest without a map, without light, guided only by love and duty. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. The greatest weight a child carries is the unlived life of its parents." and Elizabeth understood. She and her sisters were bearing that burden. Her father, in fear and weariness, had lived as one who turned away from the world. Her mother, blinded by vanity, had chased illusions of social success. Neither had truly lived from the heart. And so, Lydia's scandal was not just a personal failing. It was the echo of generations who had never faced their inner shadows. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Elizabeth realized, perhaps the fate of the Bennet family was not written by destiny, but by the things they had refused to see. Her father avoided, her mother denied, and Lydia, the wild, neglected child, acted out the chaos no one dared to confront, as if crying out, "Look at me." Only when everything fell apart did they realize that what is repressed will always return, in its most painful form. One night, Elizabeth awoke in silence. The soft patter of rain on the roof reminded her of the peaceful evenings of childhood, her father reading in his study, her mother laughing in the kitchen. All of it felt so far away now. Only emptiness remained. She prayed softly, not for Lydia, but for her father, the man searching not just for his daughter, but for his lost self amid the dusty streets of London. The next morning, Elizabeth walked through the garden. The roses had withered, their petals soaked with dew. She touched one, it was cold, and thought, perhaps human hearts are the same. Only when they reach the edge of loss do they learn what love truly means. Day followed day in silence. Mrs. Bennet continued her lamentations. Jane, ever patient, kept comforting her. And Elizabeth, though outwardly composed, they felt a growing fear. What if father doesn't return? What if he never finds Lydia? One evening, as the last light faded over the hills, Elizabeth heard the distant sound of hooves. She ran to the porch. A carriage was approaching slowly. The wheels ground to a stop before the gate. Mr. Bennet stepped down, his face gaunt, his skin gray, his eyes weary. Yet within them shone something new, awareness. He looked at his daughters, his voice hoarse. "I have done all I could." Only 4 words, yet they were enough for Elizabeth to understand that the journey had not been in vain, for he had gone. Not only to seek his daughter, but to reclaim the strength that had long slept in his heart as a father. Carl Jung once wrote, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakes. He who looks outward dreams, he who looks inward awakens." Elizabeth looked at her father and saw that he had awakened, not through intellect, but through suffering. He had dared to face the shadow he had fled all his life. And in his eyes she saw a man who had finally come home, to himself. That night, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the moonlight spread softly across the fields. She knew that nothing was resolved yet, but from within the darkness, something had begun to take shape. A fragile, living faith. Perhaps, as Jung once said, "In all chaos there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order." And Elizabeth understood that sometimes the most desperate journeys are the very ones that bring the soul home, not to another person, but to itself. 6. The letter from London, a ray of light within the darkness. That morning, sunlight fell softly across the window of Longbourn, a pale light, as if to remind the household that after every storm, the sun must rise again, even when the heart remains clouded. Elizabeth sat at the old wooden table, a cup of tea grown cold before her. Days had passed since her father's departure for London, and still no word had returned. The house was eerily quiet. Even the wind whispering through the window sounded like the sigh of time itself. Then, a knock at the door, not loud but sharp, cutting through the stillness like an arrow through waiting. Jane stepped forward, her hands trembling as the maid handed her a letter. The handwriting on the envelope made Elizabeth's heart stop. It was her Uncle Gardner's. In that instant, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Jane tore it open, her eyes darting across the lines. Her lips quivered, As she read aloud, "We have found Lydia and Wickham. They are in London, but they are not yet married." A silence fell. Elizabeth drew a deep breath, her chest tightening. The news, though carrying a flicker of hope, cut like a blade. Lydia was alive. Salvation. But not yet married. 4 words that opened a new wound, exposing a humiliation her family had barely begun to comprehend. Carl Jung once said, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." And Elizabeth suddenly felt the truth unfolding within her own home. Amid the chaos, something unseen was quietly shifting, an invisible hand rearranging fate in ways she could not yet understand. Her uncle's letter explained that someone had intervened, had negotiated with Wickham to compel him to marry Lydia in exchange for a substantial financial settlement and absolute silence. "The benefactor wishes to remain anonymous," he wrote, "but if the plan succeeds, our family's honor will be restored." Jane looked up, tears glimmering in her eyes, yet with a faint light of hope. "Lizzie, someone is helping us." Elizabeth said nothing. Within the fragile relief rising in her heart, another feeling stirred, heavy, deep, and filled with curiosity. Who could have done such a thing? Her uncle could not have afforded such generosity. Who then, and why? Her thoughts turned, almost against her will, to Darcy. His face appeared in her mind, calm, proud, composed. But she shook her head quickly, almost scolding herself for such a thought. "Impossible," she whispered. "After everything, he owes me nothing." And yet, in the quiet depths of her heart, another voice murmured, "Or perhaps he does, not out of duty, but out of love." She rose and stepped out into the garden. The sky was gray, clouds drifting lazily. Light pierced through the heavy veil, striking the withered roses, making them glow for a fleeting moment. The sight sent a shiver through her, like Lydia herself, faded but not beyond redemption. Inside, her mother's shrill, emotional voice rang from upstairs. "Lydia is alive. Praise be, someone has saved our family's honor." Mrs. Bennet rushed about the house, tears still wet upon her cheeks, already replaced by laughter. She spoke of weddings, of dresses, of how everything will soon be well again. Elizabeth watched her mother with quiet sorrow. Mrs. Bennet's joy was not born of relief that her daughter was safe, but of the hope that their social standing might be patched together again. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Mrs. Bennet was the living embodiment of that truth. In her frantic delight, she fled from the deeper reality that her daughter had not only lost her reputation, but something far more precious: her innocence and self-respect. Jane, ever gentle, murmured, "Still, it is better than nothing. At least they will be married." Elizabeth nodded faintly, her eyes distant. "Yes, if it truly happens." That night, alone in her room, the candlelight trembled upon the desk. She unfolded the letter once more, studying every line as if searching for meaning between the words. "A man has paid all of Wickham's debts." Her heart clenched. A man. The phrase echoed again and again in her mind. No name, no identity, no trace. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. In the dimness of the room, Darcy's image emerged once more. No longer proud, but quiet, solemn, almost sorrowful. She remembered his gaze the last time they met at Pemberley, a look carrying something she had not dared to name. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." And Elizabeth knew she had been transformed. She no longer viewed the world through judgment. This letter, though penned by her uncle, felt like a test for her heart. A reminder that sometimes, in the darkest hours, kindness arrives in silence, without name or recognition. As night descended, she opened her window. The cool wind swept in. Far above, a small opening appeared among the gray clouds. A slender beam of silver light, a crescent moon, fragile, faint, yet unmistakably bright amidst the darkness. Elizabeth smiled softly, whispering to herself, "Perhaps hope is not believing that all will be well, but believing that light still exists, even when we cannot yet see it." Carl Jung once said, "Even a tree that grows to heaven must have its roots in hell. Even a tree reaching toward heaven must first take root in the depths of darkness." The Bennet family now was at the lowest point of shame and despair. Yet Elizabeth sensed that from this abyss, something new was beginning to stir. Not honor, but compassion, humility, and a quiet love she had only begun to recognize. She closed the window, her gaze falling upon the letter lying on the table. In that moment, it no longer seemed like a piece of paper. It was a symbol of awakening, not only for her family, but for the human soul itself, where shadow and light at last meet and become one. 7. The marriage bargain. The price of honor. That morning, soft rain fell upon the roof of Longbourn. The rhythm of the rain sounded like a distant whisper, touching hearts already weary from worry and waiting. Elizabeth sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of very cold tea, her gaze lost in the gray sky. On the table before her lay an opened letter, her Uncle Gardner's handwriting, each line heavy with the breath of fate. Jane was reading aloud, her voice trembling and fading within the stillness of the room. "Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia, on the condition that the Bennet family provide them with a yearly allowance." Elizabeth looked up in silence. Beside her, Mrs. Bennet burst into tears, then laughter and, in the same breath, "Oh, thank heaven! At last the girl will be married and our family's honor will be saved." But Elizabeth could not share that joy. Inside her, emotions tangled like wet threads. Joy, perhaps, but fragile. Hope, yes, but with a bitter taste. She looked down at the floor, feeling as though she had just heard the verdict of a trial. Pardoned, yet not free. She knew Lydia would be married, yet this union was not love. It was redemption bought with money, the price of respectability, a transaction meant to conceal darkness beneath the thin veil of ceremony. Carl Jung once said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Human beings do not reach enlightenment by dreaming of light, but by confronting the darkness within. And Elizabeth felt the truth of that more deeply than ever. Her family now stood in that moment of reckoning, when all that had been hidden was finally laid bare. Her mother's complaints, her father's silence, Lydia's recklessness, and her own pride, all woven together into this tragedy. The letter continued. "All matters have been arranged. The sum to pay Wickham's debts and the annual allowance have already been settled." Elizabeth read that line again and again. No, this was beyond her Uncle Gardner's means. Then who could have done it? The question echoed through her mind like a bell, and suddenly a name emerged. Darcy. She trembled slightly. Impossible. He had no reason to do so. He had been rejected, humiliated. And though he had once confessed his love, how could he possibly help her family now in such disgrace? Yet, she remembered his gaze at Pemberley, no longer proud, but gentle, sincere. A look that had made her ashamed of all her former judgments. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." And Elizabeth knew she had been transformed. No longer the girl who mocked Darcy for his pride, she now understood the quiet strength behind true dignity, and the kind of love that does not need to be seen to be real. That afternoon, when the rain subsided, Elizabeth walked into the garden. The grass was still wet. The scent of fresh earth lingered in the air. She looked around. Everything seemed painfully familiar. The rose bushes Lydia once picked from. The narrow path Jane often took to visit the neighbors. Everything remained the same, and yet nothing was. Inside, Mrs. Bennet's excited voice carried through the house. She spoke endlessly of the wedding that saved us, as if the calamity had never existed. Lydia is so lucky. Wickham will be her husband. People will look at our family differently now. Elizabeth said nothing. She looked at her mother. The joy in her eyes was genuine, yet it was also a refuge from truth. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Mrs. Bennet was the living proof of that truth. She did not weep for Lydia. She wept for her broken illusions. To her, honor was the mask more precious than truth, more important than self-respect, and greater than love itself. Elizabeth could not hate her. She felt only compassion. For her mother, for Lydia, and for herself, for she now understood that everyone carries a shadow, that hidden, unconscious self Jung spoke of, where all that we deny still lives, waiting to be seen. Lydia's marriage was that shadow come alive. It exposed everything the Bennets had tried to hide, their frivolity, their blindness, their fear of judgment. Yet in doing so, it also opened a door, the door of awakening. That night, Elizabeth sat at her desk, the candlelight casting a golden glow upon her face. She looked once more at the letter. Between her uncle's lines, she imagined the unseen figure of Darcy, the man who had quietly stepped into the darkness to mend the mistakes of others, seeking no praise, no recognition. A man like that, she thought, had not only restored her family's honor, he had saved her soul from arrogance and judgment. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And perhaps, in this very moment, Elizabeth was coming closer to that truth. She realized that no one truly grows in the light. We only learn humility, gratitude, and love after walking through the darkness. She blew out the candle and turned toward the window. The night sky was streaked with pale moonlight, casting its glow upon the mist-covered fields. And there, in the stillness that ached with meaning, Elizabeth whispered to herself, "There are debts that cannot be repaid with money, only with compassion." Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind carried the scent of fresh soil, and deep within, Elizabeth felt something stirring. As if amid the shame and sorrow, a quiet light had begun to emerge. That light, though small, was the light of awakening, where old pride dissolves and a new, truer love begins to take root in the dark. 8. The Shame and the Wedding, the Marriage of Redemption. That morning, Longbourn was unusually alive. From early dawn, hurried footsteps and bursts of laughter echoed through the house. Mrs. Bennet floated from room to room, clutching a letter, repeating breathlessly, "Lydia is getting married. My darling girl is to be a wife." Tears and laughter mingled on her face, a mixture of relief and hysteria, the emotion of a mother who felt she had just escaped a nightmare. Jane stood beside her, gentle but pensive, while Elizabeth remained silent. She looked at her mother, then at the familiar home around her, and quietly turned away. Outside, the morning wind swept through the rose garden, scattering dew-soaked petals, as if nature itself were witnessing a joy tinged with sorrow. Lydia's marriage should have been a celebration, but for Elizabeth, it was a pardon without freedom, a reprieve from ruin, not salvation. Lydia was not destroyed, but neither was she redeemed. She was married, yes, but that ceremony was not born of love. It was a bargain, a transaction meant to buy back the family's reputation, paid for with money and silence. Elizabeth understood this without a word being spoken. In her Uncle Gardner's letters from London, behind the gentle phrasing, she sensed the presence of another hand, someone who had moved unseen to rescue her family from the deepest humiliation. And though the feeling came as a whisper, it burned bright within her. Darcy. She remembered the last time she had seen him at Pemberley. His eyes no longer proud but soft, steady, stripped of pretense. Now, in the wake of all that had happened, she understood that only someone like him, quiet, dignified, and courageous enough to act without applause, could have done what no one else would. Carl Jung once wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Human beings do not reach enlightenment by dreaming of light, but by facing the darkness within." Elizabeth realized that her family was living in illusion, a false light her mother clung to desperately. Mrs. Bennet did not wish to see the shame, nor to admit that Lydia's actions had stained them all. She only wanted to believe that things had been set right, that the neighbors would once again smile at her across the teacups. "It's a miracle," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, eyes glistening. "The girl will wear white. Everyone will have to bless her." Elizabeth looked at her mother with a faint smile, though inside she felt only quiet sorrow. Her mother did not know that this miracle had a price, and the one who paid it was not her. By afternoon, the sound of hooves approached from the distance. Lydia and Wickham had returned, all smiles, as though nothing had happened. Lydia rushed into the house, kissing her mother, showing off her ring and her gown. Wickham, with his familiar courteous smile, bowed politely, as if he had done something noble. Elizabeth watched them step into the parlor, feeling as though she were witnessing a play. The laughter, the cheerful chatter, all of it seemed to dance above an unhealed wound. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Lydia had not yet learned that. She did not realize this marriage was not a beginning, but a consequence, not salvation, but the echo of her own unconscious desires. And perhaps she did not care. She preferred illusion, the glittering dream of a wedding that covered what had been lost. That night, Elizabeth sat alone on the porch. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of roses and damp soil. She gazed at the dim sky, thinking of the path Lydia was now walking, and the one she herself must face. She knew that every soul carries its own shadow, its weakness, its blindness, and must one day pay the price to see it clearly. Lydia had been swallowed by hers, the shadow of vanity, of foolish romance. Yet in this shame, Elizabeth saw something luminous, the beginning of awakening. For as Jung once said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Perhaps this marriage was a ritual, thus painful, yet necessary, not to redeem Lydia, but to force the Bennet family to confront themselves, Mr. Bennet's pride, Mrs. Bennet's frivolity, and the daughter's naive illusions. Elizabeth closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw Darcy, not far away at Pemberley, but standing silently in the dim corridor of her heart, watching her with eyes both calm and forgiving. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And perhaps this was the moment Elizabeth began to understand. Love was not merely tenderness. It was courage, the courage to see, to endure, and to change. Just as Darcy had changed, so too was she being transformed, not by comfort, but by the honesty of suffering. Outside, the moon rose through a sky veiled in clouds. Its dim light fell across the floor, casting a faint glow through the window. Elizabeth followed that beam with her eyes and felt her heart grow still. Though the world was filled with illusion and deceit, she believed that every shame, when seen with truth, carried within it a seed of redemption. That night, Longbourn was silent, but within that silence, Elizabeth knew a new truth was being born, not from the music of a wedding, but from the stillness of souls learning, at last, to see themselves. 9. The Return of the Lost. When the lost child comes home. An autumn afternoon, the faint sunlight slanted across the road leading to Longbourn. As the carriage wheels ground to a halt before the gate, no one inside the house dared to exhale. Lydia and Wickham had returned. The door opened. Lydia stepped in, astonishingly proud, her face bright, her cheeks flushed, her voice chirping like a songbird. There was not a trace of shame in her, only the gleeful excitement of a child who believed she had won a romantic game. Beside her, Wickham smiled, that familiar smile, smooth, charming, and empty. Mrs. Bennet burst into tears, calling her daughter's name as she clung to her, sobbing with joy. "My darling, I knew it. I knew everything would be fine." Jane tried to smile, while Mr. Bennet merely bowed his head and quietly left the room. He could not bear the sight, this cheerful indifference displayed amid a moral storm that had not yet passed. Elizabeth stood silently at the doorway, watching the pair enter as though they were strangers. Everything in the room was familiar, yet Lydia's calm, radiant face sent a chill through her. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And Lydia was the living image of that truth. She had returned with a story freshly polished, glossed over by the word marriage, believing that everything had been erased. There was no remorse, no apology, only bright chatter, laughter, and an unearned pride. "Do you know, Elizabeth," Lydia said, her eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction, "Wickham says I'm the most beautiful bride he's ever seen." Wickham smiled, nodding slightly, his gaze gentle yet hollow, like a still surface of water concealing a deep void. Elizabeth answered with a quiet nod. She said nothing, for she understood. Some people can only survive by believing their own illusions. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Lydia was living by that law. She believed herself lucky, believing that this marriage was a beautiful destiny, not the price of recklessness. And Wickham, he believed in his own charm and eloquence, the same tools that had carried him smoothly through life, never demanding responsibility. Their shadow, Elizabeth thought, does not lie in their actions, but in their denial. Darkness is not sin. It is the pretense that sin has never existed. That afternoon, when everyone had retreated to their rooms, Elizabeth sat alone in the back garden. The autumn wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of dry grass and damp earth. Above, the faint moonlight slipped through the clouds, resting softly on her face. And in that quiet glow, she understood something profound. True darkness does not dwell in the world. It lives within the human heart. Carl Jung once wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." The Bennet family was now a living embodiment of that truth. Mrs. Bennet convinced herself that honor had been restored. Mr. Bennet escaped into silence. Lydia reveled in ignorance. Only Elizabeth, who dared to face the shame, who admitted the darkness, truly saw what was happening. That night she thought of Darcy, the man who had quietly arranged everything, saving not only Lydia's reputation, but the family's very soul. He had acted not out of pride, but out of compassion. And Lydia, the one saved, did not even know who had saved her or why. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Elizabeth felt that pain stirring deep within her, not loud but heavy, like a fracture inside stone. She no longer blamed Lydia. Instead, she felt pity for the girl who had never been given the chance to see herself. The next morning, Lydia chattered endlessly about her new home, the pleasant guests, the joy of being a wife. Everyone smiled politely. Only Elizabeth remained silent. She looked at her sister's face and saw not happiness, but forgetfulness. Lydia lived as though the past had never happened, as though every wrong could be washed away with a wedding gown. And in that moment, Elizabeth understood. Within every person lives a small Lydia. That unconscious part we refuse to see, the shadow we hide behind smiles, manners, and seemingly reasonable words. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Understanding the darkness within oneself is the only way to show compassion toward the darkness of others." When evening fell, Elizabeth walked into the garden. The sunset poured gold over the rose bushes. She inhaled deeply, feeling the coolness of early autumn. Everything around her was still the same, serene, beautiful, yet she saw it now with new eyes. Light and shadow were not separate. Each existed because of the other, like love and pride, like sin and redemption. She lifted her gaze to the twilight sky and whispered a prayer. No one is ever truly lost. Some simply have not yet found the courage to return to themselves. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And Elizabeth realized the true return was not Lydia stepping across the threshold of Longbourn, but the moment when each human being dares to return to the most honest part of their own soul. Night descended. Moonlight streamed through the window, falling softly across Elizabeth's face. She closed her eyes, feeling an unfamiliar peace, for now she knew darkness was no longer something to fear. For when one dares to face it, the inner light finally begins to speak. 10. The hidden benefactor. The secret of the Redeemer. That morning, pale sunlight spilled softly through the white curtain. Elizabeth sat alone at the table, holding a letter from Mrs. Gardner in her trembling hands. On the thin sheet of paper, the familiar handwriting stretched gently across the page, each line infused with the warmth and tenderness of the woman she so deeply respected. She unfolded the letter, unaware that within minutes her life would change, not because of tragedy, but because of truth. "My dear Elizabeth," the letter began, "you must know that what I am about to tell you cannot remain hidden forever. It was Mr. Darcy who found Lydia and Wickham. He paid the debts, arranged the marriage, and concealed everything to protect the honor of your family." Elizabeth froze. The words trembled beneath her gaze, as if written not in ink, but in the very heartbeat of the writer. She read them again, line by line, making sure she had not misunderstood. But no, the truth stood clear. Darcy, the man she once rejected, misunderstood, even resented for his pride, was the very man who had saved her family from ruin. She let the letter fall to the table, her heart pounding, breath caught in her throat. The room was so silent she could hear the rhythm of her own pulse. For a moment, every memory returned. The arguments, the irony, the cold glances, the wounded pride. But now, all of it dissolved, leaving only a profound stillness. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Elizabeth realized then, her darkness did not lie in weakness, but in pride. She had believed herself insightful, fair, immune to deception. Yet in truth, she had been guided by prejudice and wounded vanity. This revelation of Darcy's act came like a mirror, reflecting every hidden flaw she had refused to see. Mrs. Gardner's words continued, detailing everything. Darcy had left Derbyshire quietly and gone to London, tracking Lydia and Wickham through the city's filth and shadows, places where a gentleman's reputation held no weight. He had found Wickham, the man Elizabeth once thought a victim, and settled every debt, demanding only one thing in return: the restoration of a girl's honor in a world ready to condemn her. No one knew, no boast, no trace of pride. When Elizabeth reached that part of the letter, tears blurred the ink. She understood. There are people who choose to act within the dark, not because they fear the light, but because they wish to preserve that light in others. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Elizabeth smiled through her tears. Yes, they had both been transformed. Darcy's love was no longer pride, it was compassion. And her love was no longer judgment, it was understanding. She thought of Pemberley, that quiet, humble place where she first saw the real Darcy. At the time, she did not know why she felt such peace there. Now she understood. It was the moment when the darkness within her began to melt, when she saw that true light does not come from lamps, but from the heart of someone who loves in silence. Carl Jung once said, "Love is the process of my leading you gently back to yourself." Darcy had done exactly that, not through words, but through deeds. He had not tried to possess her heart, but to help her find her own. He came not to prove himself, but to redeem another soul, Lydia's, whom he owed nothing. Elizabeth rose and stepped into the garden. The morning sunlight fell gold upon the blooming roses. The air was cool, clear, as if the world itself had been washed clean. She drew a deep breath and felt something within her being renewed, as though her spirit had been purified with the dawn. In that light, another line from Jung came to her mind. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Darcy had descended into his own hell, the hell of wounded pride, of rejection, of inner struggle, to save the one he loved. And Elizabeth, too, had walked through her own, the hell of judgment, of blindness, of self-deception, to find the light of gratitude. By evening, Elizabeth sat again at the table, Mrs. Gardner's letter still open before her. The golden glow of sunset filtered through the window, illuminating the page. She touched the paper lightly and whispered, "You did it all," without ever needing to be thanked. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." And Elizabeth knew she had awakened from the dream of love measured by words and gestures, awakened from the illusion that she understood the world, awakened from the self that once blinded her. Now she no longer saw Darcy merely as a man, but as a mirror reflecting humanity itself, where pride transforms into compassion, and love ceases to demand possession, needing only to exist. Outside, night began to fall, but within Elizabeth's heart, another kind of light began to rise. Not dazzling, not sudden, but warm and true, like a lamp still burning in a house after the storm. And in that moment, she understood the deepest truth of all that Jung had ever written. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For Elizabeth, that privilege began here, with a letter, a truth, and a man who chose to love in silence, redeem in darkness, and awaken in the light of compassion. 11. The meeting with Wickham. The farewell of pride. That afternoon, the sky was veiled in a thin layer of mist. Elizabeth walked slowly along the stone path leading home, her heart calm, yet unsettled. As she turned past a corner of the garden strewn with golden leaves, a familiar voice called out, smooth, light, and just a little too familiar. "Miss Bennet." Wickham bowed, smiling as he always had, polite, confident, unreadable. Elizabeth inclined her head. "Mr. Wickham." Her tone was neither cold nor warm. Between them stretched a silence that was not born of distance, but of understanding. Wickham began with a few casual remarks about the weather, about Lydia, about his happy married life. He spoke lightly, as though everything that had happened between them was merely a scene from a play that had ended long ago. But Elizabeth knew. Some stories do not need endings, only silence. She studied him closely. The eyes that knew how to perform, the smile that could conceal, the manner that inspired trust. A man who seemed sincere but whose truth had always been crafted in words. Carl Jung once wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." A person is not defined by what they claim, but by what they do. Elizabeth remembered Darcy had restored her family's honor through quiet action, while Wickham, with his eloquence, had nearly destroyed it. Now, standing before him, she saw with perfect clarity the gulf between the man who acts and the one who only speaks. A breeze passed, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. They stood in silence for a while, and in that silence, Elizabeth realized she no longer felt anger, nor resentment, only distance. Distance so vast that it seemed this man had never truly entered her life, but had merely brushed past her. A shadow reflecting her own forgotten illusions. Carl Jung once said, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Everyone bears a shadow, and the less aware we are of it, the darker it becomes. Wickham, she understood, was the embodiment of that shadow. The part of herself she had once refused to see, the part that trusted charm, that mistook flattery for goodness, that longed to believe in the pleasant illusion of sincerity. Now she saw the truth. Wickham's danger did not lie in his wickedness, but in his ability to make others believe he was good. And the deepest wound in any human heart is not being deceived. It is realizing we once believed ourselves incapable of being deceived. Elizabeth smiled faintly. It was not a bitter smile, but one of quiet understanding. "I believe," she said softly, "that in time all things find their way to peace, Mr. Wickham." He nodded with that same confident charm. "I believe so too. Life, after all, has a way of setting everything in order." Elizabeth said nothing. She knew that within his easy words still lived the same self-deception. He had never truly repented. He was only doing what he did best, making others feel comfortable in forgiving him. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. The meeting with oneself begins as a meeting with one's shadow." And today, Elizabeth had met hers, not to condemn it, but to say goodbye. When their conversation ended, Wickham bowed once more and walked away. His smile lingered, unchanged, but for Elizabeth, its charm had vanished. She no longer saw a man, only a lost soul, a wanderer who had forgotten how to see himself. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. There is no awakening without suffering." Elizabeth had known that pain. She had loved wrongly, trusted blindly, judged unfairly. And through every wound, she had emerged quieter, wiser, gentler. As she walked home, the evening light filtered through the trees, bathing her face in a soft golden glow. She did not feel stronger, only truer. She understood now that Wickham had never truly been the villain in her story. He had been the teacher of a lesson called awakening. Through him, she learned that true light does not reside in charming words, but in actions born from sincerity. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. To understand one's own darkness is the surest path to compassion for the darkness of others." Elizabeth stopped and looked up at the sky, now tinged with violet. She whispered, almost to herself, "Not everyone dares to face their darkness, but once we do, the light will always find its way back." The wind carried the scent of grass and earth after rain. Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting her spirit rest. She knew that this encounter, small as it seemed, was the final farewell of her pride. No more anger, no more regret, only the quiet peace of one who has touched her own shadow and discovered that light, in truth, had never left. 12. The Return of Bingley and Darcy. When destiny returns. That morning, a thin veil of mist hung over the fields of Hertfordshire, as if the earth itself were guarding a secret. The first rays of sunlight slipped softly through the Bennet household windows, where Mrs. Bennet was bustling about, her voice bright with excitement as she repeated the news that had spread across the region. Mr. Bingley had returned to Netherfield. Her words filled the house with chatter, but to Elizabeth, every sound seemed distant. She stood by the window, her gaze fixed upon the dew-soaked garden, and in that stillness, a single name whispered quietly within her heart: Darcy. Rumor had it that Bingley did not return alone. With him was Darcy, the man Elizabeth had once sworn never to face again. Yet now, at the mere mention of his name, her heart trembled. That autumn was serene, yet within Elizabeth a quiet current stirred. She had endured much: the collapse of prejudice, the shame of her family, and the awakening of her own soul. Now, hearing Darcy's name, she felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, but a deep and tranquil clarity. Carl Jung once wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. We meet ourselves in countless forms, through those we once thought were merely passing strangers." Darcy, she realized, was not just a man in her story, but the mirror reflecting the shadow she had once denied. Pride, judgment, and the fear of being wounded. That afternoon, Bingley arrived at Longbourn. The air itself seemed brighter. Jane, with her familiar gentleness, blushed as he greeted her. Mrs. Bennet glowed with delight, forgetting all her usual reprimands. Elizabeth watched them quietly, her heart a blend of joy and unease, for she knew, where Bingley appeared, Darcy would never be far behind. And when his name was spoken aloud, her heart tightened, not in dread, but in longing for something left unsaid. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, his face appeared, the depth of his gaze, the hesitant smile, the voice that carried both strength and vulnerability. She remembered that afternoon at Pemberley, the beautiful awkwardness of their reunion. She remembered his letter, every word plain yet sincere, written like both a confession and a benediction. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The encounter of two souls is an alchemy. If there is reaction, both are changed." Elizabeth smiled softly in the darkness. She had changed, and she knew Darcy had too. He was no longer a man ruled by pride and propriety, and she, no longer a woman blinded by judgment. Something between them had dissolved. An old arrogance giving way to quiet understanding. A few days later, the inevitable happened. Bingley and Darcy came to call. When Darcy stepped into the room, it was as though the world stilled. Light from the window fell across his face. No longer the stern mask of a man misunderstood, but the gentle calm of one who had learned to forgive. He bowed. She replied, her voice low enough that only he could hear. And in that brief exchange, every hurt, every pride, every wall seemed to vanish. Between them remained only silence, the kind that follows storms, the kind that belongs to souls who have found each other on the far shore of themselves. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Perhaps, Elizabeth thought, destiny is not found in coincidence, but born from awakening. Only when both had faced their own darkness could they truly see one another in the light. After the visit, few words were spoken, yet between Darcy and Elizabeth, something unspoken shimmered, an understanding beyond language. Mrs. Bennet noticed nothing. Jane only blushed, but Elizabeth knew. A new chapter was beginning. That evening she walked alone across the fields. The sky had turned golden, and the breeze carried the scent of grass and warm earth. She thought of everything. The first ball, the sharp exchanges, the letter, the silent redemption. Now all the scattered fragments had come together into one clear image, not of confusion, but of meaning. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Elizabeth smiled. Perhaps that is what true love does. It doesn't make us lose ourselves. It helps us find who we are. When she returned, dusk had fallen. The garden shimmered under the honey gold light of evening. From afar, she saw Darcy standing beside Bingley. He turned, their eyes met. And in that instant she knew. Destiny had returned, quietly, humbly, right on time. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists. What we resist remains." Elizabeth had fought this feeling with all her reason, and yet that resistance had only deepened it. It had grown, like a hidden river running beneath the surface of her days. She walked toward him, a faint smile touching her lips. In that moment, every distance disappeared. There were no words, no promises, only two souls, standing side by side, who had journeyed through pride and prejudice to arrive at the simplest truth of all, love. Carl Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the mingling of two streams that, after joining, flow on forever in a deeper and broader current." And so, beneath the golden sunset, Elizabeth and Darcy stood, neither speaking nor needing to. A single glance was enough to know the old chapter had closed and a new one, written by destiny itself, had just begun.